So since you are all very busy studying for the two-part midterm that you began yesterday, you took part one yesterday and we'll be taking part two tomorrow, I thought it might be a good time to just get some stuff up on YouTube uh, for those who are interested in reviewing some things and interested in getting a feeling for what the next few weeks will be like in class. So I want this first video to review some distinctions I made last Thursday between the various modes of criticism that you've been introduced to in this class. Um, and on Thursday, I divided up all of the modes of criticism rather crudely into two categories. Right. The first category, or should I say, yeah, the first category was I labeled criticism as interpretation, or um, or criticism as the uncovering of or accounting for meaning. Okay, it's sort of what we mean by when we say interpretation, right? What is interpretation? The sort of explication of a meaning, let's say, that's either waiting for us or that, as a reader response critic might say, comes into existence when the reader engages with the literary text, or really any text. Okay. So under this umbrella fall, of course, new criticism, reader response criticism, even deconstruction, even though deconstruction can be thought of as the desedimentation of meaning, or the sort of the investigation of the play of meaning in signification and language, an investigation of how meaning sort of slips around as you attempt to pin it down. Still, deconstruction is largely concerned with a verbal and linguistic signification or meaning. Okay, so in that sense, it's still somewhat interpretive. We could say psychoanalysis, in the sense that like we could say clinical psychoanalysis is largely about the interpretation of symptoms as a means to uncover bits and pieces of the unconscious, right? Not unlike the engagement with a literary text, right? Trying to get at that thing that's sort of irrevocably hidden for us. There is no explicit account of meaning in a literary text, right? That meaning, in some sense, for a psychoanalyst might be akin to the unconscious that we're trying to bring to the surface. Uh, or we could even say that historicism, certain modes of historicism and new historicism, especially cultural poetics, is largely about trying to link up what a text might mean or what it might signify with sort of contextual materials and documents and discourses that are contemporaneous to it. Okay. So in all these ways, we could think about the work of criticism as really just the attempt to not just to pin down, but in just some way account for meaning. Whether for, as in new criticism, it's about trying to show the sort of unified meaning of the text, or whether in reader response criticism it's about giving some sort of account of the give and take or engagement between a reader and a text, between an implied author and an implied reader, perhaps, or those others I've just explained. Okay. The other category, so if that's criticism as interpretation or explication or the accounting for meaning, right? A category that links literary studies to the very ancient practice of biblical hermeneutics or scriptural hermeneutics, right? The interpretation of holy texts. The other category we could think of as criticism as the work, excuse me, as the work of critique, right? Critique meaning in this case the challenging of, right, established values, truths, the demystification of what we could think of as unquestionable assumptions about how the world, or about how people, or about how culture should operate, uh, and that criticism as critique can take many, many forms. And so the first mode of criticism that we studied that was explicitly a work of criticism as critique would certainly be eco-criticism. Okay, the way in which eco-critics tend to, even though they pay very careful attention to texts and what they signify or how they make meaning. So in that sense, is still very concerned with questions of interpretation. Nevertheless, we might say the primary aim or goal of eco-criticism would not be simply accounting for what a text means, but instead either attempting to show how a text is itself already a critique of assumptions about the relationship between human beings and the environment, or how the text is itself complicit in problematic discourses or ways of thinking and feeling and seeing the relationship between human beings and the environment. Okay, so in that articulation, if we're just thinking about criticism as critique, we can actually break that category into two separate ones as well. The critique, the demonstration that literature can, in some ways, be read as critical already, that there is a way to read, for instance, The Prelude, William Wordsworth's The Prelude, as a critique of assumptions about the human-environment relationship, especially assumptions that would be contemporaneous to Wordsworth. Or there is a work that is itself critical of Wordsworth and the poem's complicity in problematic discourses about the human and the environment. Okay, so criticism as critique can either be critique of the literary, that's the second one I've been talking about, or the demonstration that the literary is itself already operating in some ways as a critique. Okay, so that would be eco-criticism in sort of two veins. But of course, feminist literary criticism can also be thought of this way. We did this a little bit a few weeks ago when looking at a poem by Lord Byron and one by Felicia Hemans, and it was in that discussion that I attempted to show sort of two ways to think about that there's a way to read Byron's poem as failing to really give voice to or account of what's the title of that poem again? Oh yeah, okay. Of course, Juin in Haiti, the experience of Hades, of Haiti herself. Often the poet interrupts, renders Haiti silent, and really fails to develop her as some sort of sympathetic figure in that poem. So that would be a way to, that would be the beginning anyway, of a way to demonstrate a critique or to construct a critique of Lord Byron or of Don Juan itself. But there's also a way to read the poem, and I tried to demonstrate this very briefly in class, in which to think about the poem itself as critical of binary thinking when it comes to sexuality and gender, or sex and gender. That those roles are actually incredibly fluid in the poem, and so that would be a way to maybe a bit more graciously read that episode of Juin in Haiti as itself already constructing a critique of binary modes of thinking about gender and sexuality that are still very prevalent in Western culture and certainly in the United States. So anyway, those are two ways to think about criticism as critique. And those are really the two primary modes of criticism we've encountered so far that could be thought of that way: eco-criticism and feminism. And then before that was criticism as interpretation, or criticism as the accounting for meaning. As you've sort of discovered throughout this semester, however, all the divisions I've been making, all the divisions or distinctions you make between certain things are really sort of provisional or porous, right? They break down the more you really press on them. Partly because one could think of psychoanalysis itself as a mode of critique, right? What does psychoanalysis enable us to critique? Well, it enables us to critique the myth that that the self, or the I, as it were, me, Benjamin Hagen, is somehow in full control of my destiny, of my life, of my decisions, of my habits, of my desires and passions. Psychoanalysis offers us terminology and insights to really develop a critique of that idea. And often literature can itself be seen as sort of unfolding, folding that kind of critique itself. So psychoanalysis is not just interpretive in that sense, but is capable of equipping us to launch critique of certain myths or discourses about individuality, and problematic and misleading models of agency. Okay, and often there's a great deal of feminist theory and criticism that draws those insights from psychoanalysis. And likewise, eco-criticism and feminism are often do engage in very, very attentive, close readings of texts. In fact, it's almost the case that they have to in order to bring us face to face with elements of a text that have often gone unnoticed. Okay, so in that way, are often even sort of construct readings of texts that would impress even the most ardent new critic, right? The most ardent new critic that would want us to really bracket out everything from the text, and just work directly with the work itself. Okay. So again, those are some ways in which the two categories I've just developed and set up sort of bleed into each other, and there's a sort of fluidity between them. And likewise, the two categories of criticism as critique that I developed,